Good evening, and welcome to the virtual 92nd Street Y for the first of two discussions about the current state of contemporary music. I'm Allan Kozinn, and with me is Will Robin, who you know from his frequent contributions of articles about composers and new music in the New York Times and the New Yorker, New Music Box, other places. And also, if you're inclined to read musicological journals, he appears in Musical Quarterly, Journal of the American Musicological Society, and other places like that. That actually is his natural habitat because he's a musicologist and teaches musicology at the University of Maryland's School of Music. The reason he's here today is because his first book has just been published. It's called Industry, Bang on a Can and New Music in the Marketplace, published by Oxford University Press. It's an excellent book, and today is publication day. So congratulations, Will, and we'll road test some of your ideas.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's a pleasure being here.
I thought we'd actually begin with this question of musicology of new music and the current scene in the recent past. I think most people think of musicologists as people who study music from centuries ago to figure out the performance practice and other details, or there are always questions and mysteries. How did you get into contemporary musicology, and is that as new a field as it seems?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. In the last, I would say maybe 3 decades or so, musicology, I think, as a field has come to mean almost anything you could kind of do that involves analyzing music or musical history or context. When I've spoken to kind of senior scholars who went to graduate school in the 1960s or 70s at a time when you were writing a musicology dissertation, you would write about someone that died 400 years ago. It was groundbreaking in the 1970s to write about Beethoven to a certain degree. But since then, there's been so much kind of ground broken in the field that there are all these different approaches in terms of what eras of composition you might be studying and all different ways to study music. And that includes not only classical music, but popular music, jazz, folk music. My own I was very lucky to be in a graduate program where musicology and ethnomusicology, which is, the kind of broad field that used to be about studying non-Western music, but has kind of blurred a lot of boundaries now with more traditional musicology, were both approaches that we thought about and absorbed. And so the idea of writing about living composers was not all that unusual, at least a place to start when I was in graduate school. And something that had really kind of preoccupied me since I first started kind of getting really absorbed by contemporary music as a listener in college, and was really drawn to lots of kind of the world of new music in New York in the early 2010s when I was in college and grad school, and just kind of decided this would be something that I really wanted to find out more about and ultimately write about and research about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that was a good time to be there. Industry. Industry has sort of a split focus. I mean, you might pick it up thinking it's going to be a biography of Bang on a Can, and that's in there, but there's a whole lot of other stuff in there too. That's implied in the subtitle, New Music in the Marketplace. Why did you take that approach? Is it that as a musicologist, you didn't want to do just a straight bio, or
that's a great, sorry, go ahead, please.
No, you go.
This is, the Zoom conversation etiquette is always a delicate balance. I think one of the things that's, when we're talking about Bang on a Can to begin with, which is this organization that goes back to the 1980s, founded by these 3 composers, Michael Gordon, Julia Wolf, and David Lang. Originally in 1987, it was a marathon concert in downtown New York. They put on this kind of big fun festival. They wanted their friends to come. They wanted other people to come. They were hoping to kind of make contemporary music more relevant to their friends and family, and ideally the larger world. And since then, it's grown to be this kind of multifaceted organization that's still very associated with these three founding composers, but has an ensemble, a record label, a summer festival. They did a big online marathon yesterday. And so there's so many different components of Bang on a Can. And that alone would probably, just telling that story, I think would probably take up at least one book. I mean, my book stops in 2001. You could write a sequel that could tell the story of Bang on a Can from then to now. But I also knew that, what really interested me about Bang on a Can was that it presented a set of issues in this period, the 1980s and 1990s, which is where the kind of book mostly focuses on, that are not necessarily so much understood, I think, anymore, because it was a really rich period. There was a lot going on, and Bang on a Can is one of the things that kind of survived that period up to today and is important today. But when we go back to the early 1980s and 1990s, we see there were all these other kinds of institutions that were interested in new music for various reasons, and all kinds of composers, performers, record labels, presenters, who all thought that there was this moment where maybe new music could reach a broader public, and they wanted to figure out a way to do so. And so telling a straight bio, I think, would have been fine. I actually think that the Bang on a Can people could probably do that pretty well themselves. But, to understand Bang on a Can within this larger world was important. And that also helped me kind of bring in my more musicological, kind of critical eye, which is, I think, what musicologists like to do well, which is to kind of situate pieces of music, composers, institutions within some kind of political context, ideological context, social context. And so that was the kind of germ of the book, was to have Bang on a Can always as a character, but bring in all of these other institutions and political circumstances that related to their kind of trajectory in this period.
Mm-hmm. Having lived through all that, I always remember the music and the performers and the composers, and had pretty much put out of my mind a lot of that other stuff, the culture wars, the good guys and bad guys, the national endowment and the battles over that. And the book really brought back all of that stuff in a good way. I mean, it's, the thing is that music doesn't exist in a vacuum, as you know. And I think possibly what makes their story, Bang on a Can story, so interesting and dramatic is that, first of all, when they came along, there were all of these, dichotomies going on, uptown, downtown, intensely organized music versus experimental music, subsidization versus this idea that you could succeed as a composer in the free marketplace, which
Right.
I think you pretty much show that you can't really do. And then, the culture wars and all of that stuff. Do you think that there's something about the fact that they had to battle so hard? I mean, there are three composers coming out of Yale. They want to make careers, and they want to, I don't know if they particularly wanted to find an unusual way of doing it, but they did. And out of that came a really interesting organization that has been around since '87 and has really thrived. And if you say it ends in 2001, but your epilogue actually catches everybody up pretty closely, and they are constantly adding new things. How do you think it is that they hit on what became Bang on a Can?
Yeah, that's a big question, and it's kind of the question that the book keeps asking. It's not like every chapter says, like, what is Bang on a Can? It's not a murder mystery or something. But I do constantly, I'm interested in the fact that it is this organization that has so many different facets, but also has this consistent vision from the top, which is the vision of those three founding composers, Gordon, Lang, and Wolf, because it comes out of the fact that there were all of these different kind of intersecting things happening in the early 1980s for young composers. As you mentioned, there was the uptown thing, which is to say, like, you could become a composer in the 1970s or 1980s by going to graduate school, studying very intensely kind of like atonal serial music associated with people, deceased people like Arnold Schoenberg at that point, but also important composers at that time like Milton Babbitt. And you could kind of be a composer / academic and teach in maybe an Ivy League institution and write articles about your music for an academic journal and be this kind of part of this academic infrastructure that emerged during the Cold War. Or, as you mentioned, you could be kind of part of the downtown community. Maybe you were more drawn to kind of more experimental approaches that weren't so based in, very fixed notated scores, but were drawing on the kind of John Cage idea of anything can be music. And you might make music not in an academic situation, but, with your friends and collaborators in the San Francisco Bay Area or downtown New York. And, Philip Glass and Steve Reich come out of that impulse, that minimalist downtown impulse. And those are very established ideas by the 1970s. And by the 1980s, when Bang on a Can, the three founders, are studying at Yale, they kind of took a little bit from both worlds because they were academics in a way. They went to graduate school, and they were really interested in minimalism. And they, when they got to New York after school, they all moved downtown and they started making music down there. And they didn't quite find a place where you could do both of those things, which is that they all wanted to write traditionally notated and quite detailed music, mostly for other people, like virtuosic classical musicians to perform. But they also were interested in minimalism. They were interested in world music. They were interested really importantly in rock music and incorporating that. And so the festival was in part a way to bring together all of those different musical interests. And then also they felt that if they did that, if they kind of provided a place for this aesthetic or this scene that didn't quite have a voice yet, that then they could also perhaps reach a broader audience. And that becomes the kind of second part. One is this kind of merging of different identities and styles. And then the second thing is they believed at that time that new music could have a larger audience than the academic or the downtown scenes did. Mm-hmm. One thing that I think is important that I kind of emphasize in the book is that, when they talk about their story, that's the story that they tell. That's not necessarily the story that I tell. And one important thing is that there were other people, other musicians, other institutions who were already finding a big audience for new music. I talk about the New York Philharmonic's Horizons festivals, which were enormously successful in the early 1980s for neo-romantic music. I talk about Philip Glass's enormous career by the 1980s when, the Brooklyn Academy of Music is selling out a whole run of his opera Satyagraha for 10,000 people. So it's not like they were alone in this. And part of the point of the book is to show that they were part of a larger movement that was doing all of this work in this time. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of the points that you raise actually is that while it looks like Philip Glass and Steve Reich were able to survive in the marketplace as such, that they actually, in a way, didn't. I mean, because once they began getting commissions, those commissions were underwritten by grants and fundraising, all that stuff that they didn't have to do, but someone did it. So in a way, I mean, are there composers who have survived purely in the marketplace, so far as you know?
I mean, I would think film composers, right? John Williams, John Williams certainly gets commissioned, right? But, well, I think that's worth considering. But, I think that I use this word marketplace in a few different ways in the book. One is to just signal a broader impulse beginning in the 1970s, but really picking up in the 80s and 90s, that if Milton Babbitt kind of famously argues in this 1957 essay that was retitled by High Fidelity, Who Cares If You Listen, and has come to kind of stand for this impulse of the composer who does not need an audience, although it's a little more complicated than that. But he does argue ultimately that the composer can retreat from the broader audience, the broader marketplace, into the academy. And the impulse I'm interested in is essentially the reversal of that. The idea that composers can and should embrace a non-academic audience and a broader audience, a non-specialist audience, we might say. And ultimately that there was related to this idea that perhaps composers can find money in places that are not traditional, which is to say, if composers in the mid-century US and the mid-20th century were primarily getting their money from foundations, academic agencies, kind of like little downtown things, perhaps they could get money without grants from the government or without grants from foundations. And that was ultimately not true. The composers who succeeded well with audiences were similarly underwritten, just as composers have kind of always been underwritten, at least in the 20th century and 21st century in the US. And you can be a very successful composer and make a career as a composer, but you can't necessarily do so in a for-profit environment. The example that I use that kind of demonstrates this, I think, most clearly is the kind of strange fascination in the 1990s of the major record labels in contemporary music. And there's this moment when you have all these giant for-profit corporations thinking that new music is somehow this way for them to make a ton of money, and it doesn't work out for them or for the composers.
No.
But yeah, we can talk about that too if you want to. Yeah.
If you want to head off in that direction, I mean, the big labels seemed entirely unsuited for dealing with new music in a serious way. You know, I'm thinking of Sony in particular because Bang on a Can recorded for Sony. You know, they wanted a new Titanic score, you know, every disc out. And they didn't seem, you know, just as an outside observer, they didn't seem really willing to put anything into it. They didn't really seem willing to deal with what the performers and composers saw as what they were doing. I mean, I remember also even way before Bang on a Can, a dozen years before Bang on a Can signed to Sony, and they signed Philip Glass.
I was about to mention that, yes.
And, you know, the first thing they put out was Glassworks, which, you know, it's not a bad album, but it was absolutely not what Philip Glass was famous for. Philip Glass was famous for things that went on for 4 hours without a break, and these were, you know, 5-minute little pieces. And I asked him about it at the time. You know, why is this your first album for them? And I believe he said something to the effect of them being turkeys. He also took the precaution of signing on as a keyboardist rather than as a composer. But never
that allowed
actually,
him, to decamp.
yeah, that allowed him
right.
to take other things when they came along, to Sony's surprise. I think at the time it was Columbia Masterworks.
It was CBS, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, you know, I should have mentioned this earlier, but you wrote kind of voluminously about new music in this period, and so much of your work I drew on and was hugely important to my research. And that includes you do have a piece from, I guess, the early 80s, I think, about Glass, where you talk about, you know, basically this kind of trials and travails of CBS, where he wants them to record, I don't remember if it's Satyagraha or Akhenaten, and they're like, let's do Glassworks, and then let's do Songs for Liquid Days. Like, let's sell these crossover albums, which is, you know, in the 1980s, there was a sense among some of these kind of mid-tier labels like None Such and ECM, which ECM had been an experimental jazz label, but in 1978, Deutsche Grammophon, the major classical label, had this recorded Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians, this kind of what would become a canonic work of minimalist music. And they basically punted it. They didn't know what to do with it. And so ECM took it and they released it, and they sold 100,000 copies, which was a big deal for a contemporary album. And so ECM starts releasing albums by living composers, including Arvo Pärt, especially in the mid-1980s. None Such, Robert Hurwitz, who had worked at ECM, moves to None Such and takes that label over, which was part of Warner, and makes it into this kind of like niche label that's very heavily curated, but could also, you know, release an album that would sell several 100,000 copies. So like Le Mystère des Voix Bulgares, the Mystery of the Women's Bulgarian Voices, or Caetano Veloso albums, and world music. And, you know, Reich and Glass become part of the None Such idea. And then what ends up happening, the kind of story that I hone in on in the book, is in the early 1990s, None Such releases a recording of a piece by the composer Henryk Górecki, his Symphony No. 3. This had been recorded several times. It's kind of a semi-obscure Polish composer. The piece had already become kind of a cult hit in Britain, especially. And this record with Dawn Upshaw goes, I mean, it's kind of unprecedented. It starts selling by the 1993, like 10,000 copies a day. It ultimately sells 1 million copies. It ends up on the British pop charts. And so that's the moment when all these major labels who have, you know, Sony hasn't known what to do with Glass. I think at that point he's basically left for None Such. they're all suddenly like, oh, new music, like this will be, this is the new three tenors if we get Goretzky and Arvo Pärt and Glass and Reich. And so, Bang on a Can, and to bring it back to Bang on a Can, they're always, I think, thinking strategically, and they're always very smart about the kinds of decisions that they make. And so, Sony reaches a producer from Sony named Martin Harry reaches out to them about working with them. He actually reaches out to David Lang and says, I'd like to do an album of your music. And David Lang says, well, I've got this whole organization. Let's do the whole thing. And so they released this album called Industry, title of my book, title of a piece by Michael Gordon, title of the album on Sony in 1995. And it does fine. But no one was blown away by the sales. And I don't think Sony actually knew what to do with it once they recorded it. It's a great album. And, that kind of becomes the pattern by the mid 1990s, is these major labels do all this investment and then they don't know how to market these things well. They put out ads in Rolling Stone and stuff. And, the story, one of the stories that I tell in the book is how there were all of these institutions, whether for-profit record labels or presenters like Lincoln Center or the National Endowment for the Arts that invested in new music in this period, and many of them by the end of the 1990s pulled out in various ways, whether that was the decimation of the National Endowment for the Arts funding by the evangelical right in the 1990s, or whether that was the record industry basically saying, like, unless you sell 100,000 copies, unless you do the Titanic soundtrack or John Corigliano's like The Red Violin, or the Immortal Beloved soundtrack, or Chant or whatever, we're not interested in you. And so Bang on a Can starts its own record label in 2001, and that becomes the trajectory, start your own thing, which had always been part of Bang on a Can, but was also part of it kind of at that point as well.
We should say that their label is called Cantaloupe.
Yes, Cantaloupe. Cantaloupe Music, great album. Lots of great albums on there.
Yep. And in fact, it seems out of this experience of recording for Sony and the experiences other people have, some of which you've mentioned, a lot of people seem to feel that really starting their own label was a good idea. I mean, Glass eventually did with Orange Mountain Music. He did also at the very beginning of his career. He had a label called Chatham Square, and ultimately went on to do Orange Mountain Music. The next talk I'm doing is with Judd Greenstein, who is a composer, runs New Amsterdam with other people. He's one of the founders and directors. And then you have labels like Starkland and other small labels that specialize in new music and seem to know how to do it. But I mean, do you think that it finally was the experience of dealing with the big corporations that finally led Bang on a Can in particular to say, why don't we just do it ourselves?
Yeah, I do think so. So after the Sony chapter, they released 2 albums with Sony. The second is called Cheating, Lying, Stealing. They put together this partnership with Point Music, which was one of these basically imprints that all the major labels, when they're hunting for more new music, they start all these little imprints. One's called Point. It was curated by Philip Glass and Philip Glass's producers. And they released a lot of really interesting stuff, including, Glass's David Bowie and Brian Eno influenced Low Symphony. And Bang on a Can pitched to them basically a live acoustic rearrangement of Brian Eno's canonic ambient album, Music for Airports. And that's like a kind of really important project for Bang on a Can. It really puts them on a map in a lot of ways. They tour that project with their All-Stars Ensemble for a few years. It becomes, I think, something that really unlocks a new audience for them. It does pretty well. It gets onto the ambient charts. It does not do, at the level of the Goretzky, but at this point, I don't think anyone in the world of new music is expecting that to happen again. But everyone at the major labels is saying, you have to hit these benchmarks. And so it's after that album, I think they have kind of a little bit of a breakdown of a communication with Point. And, we haven't really talked about this, but, Bang on a Can, early on in my research, they granted me access to their archives, which included not just their physical archives, which include things like program booklets and press materials, but also very, very kindly, 2 of their staff, Kenny Sabelson and Tim Thomas, basically let me on their hard drives. And so I did all my archival research, like when I was living in North Carolina. A good chunk of it, my archival research was like sitting on my laptop in, an outdoor cafe or something, looking through all of their, basically Word documents from 1991 or whatever. And so the archive has some some correspondence which makes clear that this relationship is not working out the way that they wanted it to. And when they found Cantaloupe Music in 2001, Gordon, Lang, and Wolf, are talking to Billboard and saying basically there were these benchmarks set and we knew we couldn't meet them. And also, like, the reason why small labels are so important in new music is because, it's a culture that is really based around composers wanting to do what they want to do artistically. And so major labels, this is not a new music specific thing. This is every genre of music that major labels may want something different from what the artists want, right?
Right.
But when we go back to the 1950s and 1960s, the earliest kind of new music recordings are by these specialist labels like Composer Recordings Inc. or New Albion, or and that's always been the case. That is a kind of recording has always been kind of an independent enterprise, and then there are these moments in which the major labels do something, and sometimes it works really well, like in the Music of Our Time series, which Columbia put out in the late 60s and early 70s, which released Terry Riley's In C and a bunch of other really important recordings. But those are almost always these kind of like short-lived bubble moments.
Just to get back to None Such briefly, I don't think it would be fair to say necessarily that they took this, out of the Bang on a Can playbook. But Bob Hurwitz eventually signed Wilco and Joni Mitchell, and suddenly you had this classical label with a lot of rock people on it. And in a way, from the start, Bang on a Can embraced rock as well. I mean, at the time of the first marathon, I think Michael Gordon still had his band, right? Was it Peter and the Girlfriends?
Peter and the Girlfriends. They had broken up by then. They broke up in like 82.
They broke by then. And he started the Michael Gordon Philharmonic yet, which was also a rock band. Yeah. And this was, I think, for me, an important thing, because they were really in the first generation of people, of composers, performers, musicians, who had gone to school, listened to everything, they didn't have a dog in the fight between uptown and downtown. They listened to things from both areas and they liked it, and they listened to rock and they listened to jazz. And I think they felt that there's a place where all that stuff can come together.
Yeah.
And I think you can see that in the Bang on a Can All-Stars, which is the ensemble they started that, as you mentioned, toured with the Brian Eno piece, toured with a whole lot of stuff. That ensemble has an electric guitar, percussion, piano, cello, and reeds, particularly low reeds.
And they're amplified. They're all amplified.
Yeah. And it's not your typical chamber group. I think that was one exciting aspect of Bang on a Can that I think flowed outward, over the next couple of generations, or at least the next generation, depending how you count. It might be a good time to play the piece of music that you brought, which is a piece by Julia Wolf called Lick. And she's, I think, using lick in the sense of like a guitar lick. There may be, who knows what else is going on there.
So this is a performance that Bang on a Can has in their archives, a video recording of an excerpt from Wolf's Lick, which is written in 1994. And the performance is by the Bang on a Can All-Stars, which is the ensemble that they started in 92, the sextet you mentioned, at Tanglewood in the summer of 1994. So let's watch a little bit of Lick.
I think when I mentioned the lineup, I left out the double bass. Just
I said it briefly, but it might have gotten lost in the traffic. But yeah, naming all six of the All Stars instruments is a skill I've been developing in my last couple of years of doing talks.
And I think that you can hear in that there are probably still people out there who feel that any cross pollination between rock and classical music is inherently a bad idea, but you can see we're not talking about orchestrated Chuck Berry riffs. It's there is the energy of rock, I think, is what they've taken from it. But I don't think that is in any way a simplistic piece.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets to some of the kinds of binaries that were used in this period, which I think are in some ways problematic. The language that was often used to frame the All Stars of kind of like the power of rock, but the precision of classical, I think can sometimes do a disservice to rock and popular music, which also has precision.
But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can go on about this. And this is, I think, maybe one of the areas. Do you want to say something? Go ahead.
Sure. No. I was saying, go ahead. You can go on about
okay.
it. So
okay. This is, I think, maybe one of the areas where I have a little bit of a kind of revisionist take in comparison to some of the press, including your writing around the All Stars and Bang on a Can in this period, which is like I don't necessarily see the Bang on a Canners as the kind of first generation of people breaking down the boundaries between, let's say, contemporary experimental music and rock. Like if you go back a few years earlier to the 1970s, you see figures who I think at the time of the 1990s and early 2000s were kind of forgotten, like Arthur Russell, for example, who's a kind of amazing genre, someone who works in disco, works in new music, works in folk and rock. And so there were these figures who were kind of working in this more experimental idiom in all these different styles. And what I see as the difference between those people and Bang on a Can is precisely what the All Stars is, which is what Bang on a Can was. The three composers, Gordon Lang Wolfe, were interested in doing was writing rock influenced music for a chamber group. They all saw themselves from fairly early in their careers as wanting to be notators in the classical tradition, because to write genre bending music, you do not have to do it for chamber music, and you don't have to have a musical score at all. Like Arthur Russell was someone who just did it himself. But they all write music for these other musicians. Like if you don't know Bang on a Can at all, the All Stars are not the three founding composers. They are six very virtuosic, trained classical musicians. And so that's, I think, the kind of underlying classical-ish aesthetic influence and kind of the practices of classical music that are kind of at the underpinnings of some of Bang on a Can's activities is also something that I kind of emphasize throughout in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and if you look in the rock world too, you see earlier than Bang on a Can, way earlier than Bang on a Can, people who also are really writing chamber music for rock instruments, Gentle Giant, bands like that, where there aren't three bars sequentially in the same meter. So it's about time this happened, and I think that Bang on a Can helped, I think, make it acceptable.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Judd Greenstein. That influence, I think, Bang on a Can was the most kind of public, I think, people who were doing that and had such a strong influence on subsequent composers, including they're not even the younger generation anymore, the young-ish, or I don't know, generation of composers who were, came out in the early 2000s, many of whom passed through Bang on a Can Summer Festival, including Judd. And that's actually, my dissertation was on that, the so-called indie classical scene, which is a term that has been disavowed for almost a decade now, and which feel free to not mention when you talk to Judd, because there's a whole polemical situation around there that we don't have to get into today. But
right, yeah. So obviously, when Bang on a Can started and wanted to find this, other way of reaching a big audience and bringing all kinds of music together, it had this nice grungy feeling of, being at the, the Rap Arts Center. I remember the Rap Arts Center. I kind of liked those concerts there, and La Mama and others. And when they played at La Mama, I remember that marathon. It was supposed to be, noon to midnight, and I remember getting out of that at 2 a.m.
Wow.
And when they moved up to Lincoln Center, I had real misgivings about that at the time, partly because it wasn't grungy. I thought it should be grungy, but definitely at a place like Lincoln Center, they were not going to be able to go until 2 a.m. I mean, you've got union houses. It just wasn't going to happen. Do you feel, or did they have themselves any misgivings about the fact that by sort of cleaning up and going uptown, that it was going to take something away from the original spirit of Bang on a Can?
Yeah, this is one of those moments where, not being there is a real disservice for me to not know what it felt like to be at the Rap Arts Center in 1991 or 1990 versus Lincoln Center in 1997, and reading your writing, the writing of critics like Kyle Gann, and others who were there for the whole kind of origins, it is clear that something kind of fundamental changed. It felt like a different environment for them. And internally, the three composers, when they kind of got the call in 1993 or 4 from Jane Moss, who basically beginning in 1992 and until just maybe 6 months ago when she stepped down, was overseeing programming at Lincoln Center and was a hugely important force for Lincoln Center really embracing contemporary music beginning in the 1990s. When they got the call to go to Lincoln Center, they had this, I had some of the old interviews you can read with them. They'll talk about the kind of internal debate they had among the three of them where, David Lang, who was a composer who was kind of the most academically credentialed of the three of them, is a composer, I should say. And he had performances of his music at Lincoln Center in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He was the one, as the kind of establishment-ish one, he was the one who was kind of like, no way, like we have to kind of preserve our independence. We have to preserve this kind of subversive spirit. And on the other hand, Gordon was the one who had the most kind of DIY credentials, who had this art rock band and then the Michael Gordon Philharmonic. And he was kind of, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but basically like, I don't want to have to clean the toilets anymore. Like, why don't we let someone else pick up some of the work on this? And Julia Wolf similarly, in some of the interviews she gave in the 1990s, talked about, this would be really an opportunity for Lincoln Center to program works by women, by world music composers, by composers of color, and just by other diverse voices. And that was kind of, she was leaning in the Lincoln Center direction as well. And so they ultimately decided, that yes, this would be a good thing for the organization. And the way that they framed it too was they wanted to, again, reach a new kind of different audience. They were always looking for ways to find new audiences for their music. And there are, you in your reviews of the Lincoln Center things, I think, come out generally positive. This seems to work. And there are other critics who felt this was a catastrophe for the organization. And it's not my job to pick. I wasn't there. But I am always interested in the fact that when they have these decisions, they decide to go to Lincoln Center, and they want that to be a place for them. And, that maybe, again, points to this kind of ways that they may present themselves as scrappy, which is true from the beginning, and they're always still kind of scrappy at heart, but they're also, an organization that's strategic and that's, not huge, but big in the world of contemporary music, and there's, I think, always a tension between the rhetoric that some of these organizations use and their kind of the institutional practices of what they end up doing that I find interesting as a scholar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my feeling was that I had those misgivings, but when it really came down to it, the performances were good, the music was there, and you can't ultimately decide that you're gonna fight your battle for grungy places that can go till 2 a.m. It was nice while it lasted, but I don't think that they got into this to be unsuccessful enough to be stuck in grungy places.
Yeah. I mean, it's also, I think it has to do with a certain set of priorities, right? Because there are composers like, for example, Phil Nieblock, an incredible composer who's been making drone music in Experimental Intermedia, which is a loft in downtown New York, for 50 years now. And that has always been a small, closely knit communal scene. And if the goal of your music as an experimental composer is to make music as part of a small community, then it makes sense for your music to kind of survive and thrive in a way in a loft environment, as kind of untenable as it is to have any kind of loft kind of performances in New York in the last 15 or 20 years. It's very hard for experimental intermediates to survive. And that's the same with places like, today, like Roulette or Issue Project Room, that are hugely important for nurturing musicians who are writing music that is maybe not for the big audience, which is great. I think that's important. Or who are on the stepping stones to figure out what they want to do. And, Bang on a Can has a different notion of success. They've always wanted to, I think, move to the bigger platforms, while I think carefully making sure, again, with the record industry being an example of this, that they can keep their artistic priorities kind of foregrounded. I don't ever necessarily, the goal of the book is not to show moments where they're selling out, where they're sacrificing their artistry for capitalism or whatever. But I do think that they have always, in 1987, Tim Page, the fantastic music critic, went to the first Bang on a Can marathon, and David Lang told him in an interview that was printed in the review, he says, "We have global aspirations." And at the time, I think that was a joke because, you're a 27-year-old composer or whatever, like, we have global aspirations, but it ends up being true. They have global aspirations. I mean, they aspired and they succeeded. So.
What do you think is next for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question to ask of all the artists.
They have an ensemble, they have a record label.
The most recent thing, which again, the book stops in around 2001, 2002. So I don't have as much of the kind of interview of that period, of the more recent period, as I do of the earlier years. But they have started this kind of related organizations, One Beat and Found Sound Nation, which are these kind of social justice / diplomacy wings of the organization that are doing some kind of work of global musicians kind of moving around the world and doing more kind of educational and outreach efforts, which I think is something that you see a lot of organizations doing now is important. The Summer Festival continues to be the kind of home base for younger composers and performers who go there and study with the founders and learn how to collaborate with each other. And then what was next, which was supposed to happen in last May, was this huge festival called Long Play, which was going to be kind of like big ears for New York. Multiple days of music in multiple venues in Brooklyn, and obviously that did not happen. Hopefully that will happen in the future. And for now, they've been putting on online marathons live streamed from musicians' homes every couple months, and the last one was yesterday. I think they've already scheduled one for April. And the bigger question is, how can the arts survive this pandemic? And that's, again, one of the answers that I think is important is a return to government funding. Not even the government funding of the 1980s or 90s. It's the return to the government funding of the 1930s is what we need. But we'll see.
I should probably mention that if people listening to this have questions, they can type them in, and we will get to them moderately soon. There was another, to get back to the sort of dual focus of the book. One of the sort of, I guess, heroes that comes out of this book beyond Bang on a Can is John Duffy, who founded Meet the Composer. And, to this day, we all watched the Bang on a Can marathon yesterday, and it's still a little bit Meet the Composer. In between works, they talk to the composers and the performers, and they did that at the earliest marathons too. How do you feel that someone like John Duffy influenced them?
Yeah. So John Duffy is a fascinating figure and someone that I think, I'm reluctant to use the word hero to describe the maybe the protagonists in my book. Musicology doesn't do well with hero worship, I think. Right. But if there is a hero, someone who I kind of unabashedly am interested in and like, it's John Duffy, who passed away a few years ago. Before I got the chance to speak with him, I was still kind of figuring out my research at that point. And I was actually very lucky to attend memorial service and concert held in his honor by New Music USA, which is the organization that succeeded Meet the Composer. And when I was there, it became clear how kind of magnanimous his role was and how widespread his role was, because the kinds of composers who spoke up from him, from I was sitting next to Libby Larson, I spoke with her, Charles Warren, Muhal Richard Abrams, Steve Reich, John Corigliano. I think all of those were in attendance, and others. What Meet the Composer did, which originated as basically a kind of project by the New York State Council on the Arts, the statewide arts funding agency in the 1970s. It launched as basically an organization overseen by Duffy in 74, with the goal of building audiences for composers, with the idea that basically Duffy kind of imagines that if composers are having dialogues with audiences, this will do the kinds of things that Bang on a Can wants, which is build a bigger audience for contemporary music. But also he really saw this as a way for composers to build a profession that, in the 1960s and 70s, it was, and still today to a certain degree, it's never really clear, is being a composer in the United States a hobby or a profession? And what Duffy wanted to build resources, to build a movement to make the case that composers are professionals. And so they would award grants. They would got all this funding and awarded all this funding for composers to go to concerts and talk to audiences about their music, so that every concert would start with the composer giving a little spiel. That was kind of their initial granting, was these little grants for composers to go to concerts. By the 1980s, they start this orchestra residencies program, this massive multi-million-dollar endeavor funded by the NEA, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and seems crazy now, funded by Exxon. Exxon spent hundreds of $1,000s to place composers and residents at major American orchestras across the country. And this had a transformational effect, I think, far beyond the effect that Bang on a Can had in the 1990s, of placing composers at the center of a lot of orchestras, the New York Philharmonic, Minnesota Orchestra, LA Philharmonic, and with the idea that if a composer is in an orchestra environment, they can, and has a voice, they can really change what the organization is about. And so the other part of Duffy that I think is really interesting is that he really genuinely believed in composers from all kinds of different aesthetic camps coming together, sitting in a room together, awarding grants to one another, and ultimately saw that the bridging of boundaries between different kind of aesthetic currents in new music would strengthen composition as a profession. And so the connection to Bang on a Can is basically Meet the Composer funds one of the orchestral residencies at the New York Philharmonic. One of the teachers of Bang on a Can at Yale, Jacob Druckmann, who was a pretty important composer in this period, is the composer in residence in 1983. And he starts this, uses the Philharmonic and Meet the Composer funding to launch this massive festival, the Horizons Festival, which happens 3 times, was initially themed around New Romanticism and kind of got broader than that. And for the 3rd festival in 1986, David Lang was hired to be his assistant and helped curate the festival. And as I spoke with David, more and more it became clear actually that Druckmann kind of almost gave him the reins in really picking the music and kind of meeting with the Philharmonic board. He had a kind of catastrophic meeting with the board, and kind of really organizing this festival. And, this was an opportunity for Lang, one that he, kind of seized upon. And it was also ultimately a disappointment for Lang, which is that, he saw that despite this massive endeavor and Duffy's encouragement, and Duffy really put his heart and soul into this organization and into these residencies, and he fought for these composers. The Philharmonic, cared, but they cared more about whatever Zubin made it was, whatever Beethoven that was being conducted that weekend. And he recounted a story to me, David Lang, where he walked into when they said, we need you to organize our scores, the scores that we've been soliciting for composers over the past few years. And it was this closet just full of unopened envelopes of scores that composers had been sending for years. And that spoke to the idea for him, and then for Bang on a Can, that orchestras were not necessarily going to be the path, and that they would have to start their own festival, imbue their own kind of spirit into it, and take the reins themselves. So that's, Horizons is almost never talked about with regard to Bang on a Can. I'm kind of restoring that as an important precursor chapter to Bang on a Can's history.
Mm-hmm. I think you pointed out that the first year of Horizons was extremely successful, and then it tapered off in the subsequent years. We do have one question which sort of fits into that, which is, what do you think of the current health of the new music of new music in the marketplace. Do you feel that new music is growing? And if not, what can we do to fix it?
It's a great question. I think one of the great things that has happened in the last 2 decades or so, and that I kind of deal with in my dissertation and a little bit towards the end of the book, is that I think new music, contemporary music, contemporary classical music, whatever phrase you want to use, there are a bunch of different reasons to use different ones, has gone from being this extremely kind of niche phenomenon to being really seen as important to the world of classical music, which is in the 1970s and 80s, orchestras, they'd pat the composers on the head and they'd, commission something every once in a while. And now, if an orchestra doesn't have some relationship to a living composer, strong relationship, or some kind of, significant new music series, they are going to generally get kind of raked over the coals in the press, and things might change. And I think a generation of administrators and conductors have grown up with the idea that new music is important. And I kind of, maybe I call it in the book like a cottage industry, which is that you can be a professional performer and dedicate yourself primarily to new music. So theoretically, new music has grown an enormous degree. There's all kinds of opportunities available. There are more commissions than ever. There are more record labels than ever. There are more ensembles than ever. There are more people doing it, I think, than ever. But at the same time, opportunities are opportunities. Stability, I think, is something that's more elusive. And it is hard to make a life as a musician in the United States, no matter what genre you're in. The kind of middle-class touring career that one could have even 15 years ago is much less viable due to music streaming services, Spotify, and the fact that you can't make money off of records anymore. And, there are all of these opportunities, but the question becomes, can you survive? Can you make a living as a composer in the United States? And I think that there are certainly a lot of composers who are showing that you can, and then there are a lot of composers who are struggling to do so. And I think, as much as we should emphasize that new music maybe has a bigger audience than ever, although I think that there's no actual way I can't measure that. I didn't say that in the book, because how would I possibly assess that? We still, I think, have to be careful to say that, again, the idea of the marketplace, which is a kind of fiction unto itself, is not necessarily the most sustainable path for composers today.
Right. Actually, places like the Philharmonic were always taken to task by the press.
Yes, that's true.
For not doing about the music, and they never listened to us.
Well, even Alan Gilbert was certainly listening, and even Jaap van Zweden right. seems to listen more, or Deborah Borda or whatever. Yeah, that's a good point, though. That certainly the press always had its knives out. Obviously there were critics who didn't care at all, but
yeah. In working on this book, you had access to their archives, which is a great thing. And you seem to have gone to all kinds of places reading grant proposals, which I can't imagine sitting through that. But hey, what were the difficulties? Was there anything that caused, that where there were roadblocks, or anything that you had to work around?
Yeah, I've been extraordinarily fortunate in this project in terms of what has been available and what I've been able to find archivally. And so much of the project was going to some archives I knew about, then talking to people, I did a lot of interviews for this project, finding out more about other organizations I hadn't known about, and then kind of hunting them down. And so that, that initial core of research was the Bang on a Can internal materials. But I also knew that to really tell a full picture of this period, to just rely on this one internal organization was not going to be enough, and could also maybe bias me in unfair ways towards what they are up to. And so, there were individual archives at the New York at the New York Public Library that were really important, like Jacob Druckmann's papers are there, the Composer Recordings Inc. papers are there. The New York Philharmonic, which is an amazing archive, for years that was run by Barbara Hawes, who recently retired. I spent a lot of time there. One of the most important collections that I looked at, which was remarkable because I didn't go there, was the New York State Council on the Arts Archives, which are in Albany. And a couple of years ago, probably not now due to COVID, they would actually scan materials for a fee and send them to researchers. And so I was able to request from them, hundreds of not hundreds of pages, dozens of grant applications that were sent to the New York State Council, which was basically the statewide equivalent of the NEA. And that was extraordinarily helpful. So I guess as far as roadblocks go, there were institutions where I either ran out of time before I got to investigate them, or there are foundations that I reached out to and said, we're a closed shop. I spent a few very fruitless days at the National Archives, which is the U.S. government National Archives, which is very fortunately in College Park, which is where I teach. It's close to the university. Trying to hunt down NEA documents to see basically, did the NEA keep all the grant applications that were sent to them, like the New York State Council did? And it was the situation where, it's a very complicated archive, and they have military documents there. That's what most people are working on there. And I got some crazy spreadsheet that had to be decoded by another spreadsheet from the 1994 or something, and it ultimately yielded like just a lot of unreadable characters that maybe suggested that they did not have the material. So I gave up on that. But finding all of this material, which is what archives are kind of musicologists' bread and butter, but often when musicologists work on more contemporary music, we don't think to look to art. I think everything's happening right now. We could just go talk to people. But so much of what I saw in the archives nuanced what I was hearing from people, or often contradicted it in ways that were fruitful.
Mm-hmm. That raises a sort of an interesting question, which is that for musicologists in days of yore who research the old stuff, everybody's dead.
Yeah.
And you don't have to, there are no sensitivities about maybe letters that you can't read, or
sure.
Whatever else. Probably in this project that wouldn't have been something that you ran into, but for a musicologist working on contemporary stuff, is that an issue? Is that something that you've run into?
Absolutely. It's not just that I wrote a book about 3 contemporary composers. I wrote a book about an institution that's still around, and I hope people read it. And that means that if people read it, it's going to change their perspective on an organization that's putting on concerts, that has an audience, that's fundraising. And so, it's not that there were things I couldn't say, but that's certainly something that I thought a lot about. This is it's an ethical issue that ethnomusicologists think about a lot. And my colleagues, at the University of Maryland think about this too. And I've talked about this with them. When you're doing ethnomusicological field work, which is often, you go to a foreign country or a place where you don't know people, and you get to know who they are, and you get to know their society, and maybe their society is different from you. When it comes time to publish your findings, you have to be very careful about what you're publishing in terms of privacy, but also, you're an outsider to that group, and you have to think about, what does it mean to represent this group from the outside? And, my colleague at Maryland, Sievely, works on Romani musicians in France. The pejorative term would be gypsy musicians. And so for her to be an outsider to that group, and then to write a book about them, requires thinking very carefully about the history that Romani musicians have had with outsiders, and Romani's specific more generally. And that's a very fraught history. Now, Bang in a Can does not have that history. They are academics. They are they teach at universities that are not that unlike the university that I teach at. So there's not that kind of power differential there. But at the same time, I always think it's worth thinking through those issues as I did this work, as I talked to people. And I did ultimately share a close to final draft with Gordon, Lang, and Wolf, and I solicited their feedback because I didn't have to, but I wanted to, because I knew that they were going to give me the best edits, because they were going to pay the most attention to it, besides my wonderful editor, Suzanne. But also that they would bring their own perspective to things. And they did. We argued over things over email, about things that arguments that I was making versus arguments that they felt were different. And ultimately, I kind of would press my voice in the most important parts and always emphasize, like, this is how I see this, but perhaps there's a way to kind of nuance that to also make clear that there's a divergence here. And, to try to find a way to portray this as honestly as I could, and to try to reflect what this period was, not just for them, but for all these other people.
Okay, we have another question from Charles Cash. Can you talk about the opposition to the Endowment for the Arts funding in the 80s and 90s? Would those funds have been accessible for, he has in quotes, middle class composers, or affected the viability of the profession?
Thank you. Hi, Charles. Charles is one of my oldest friends from high school. That's a great question.
Yeah.
So the opposition, there's a national opposition to funding for the NEA that begins in the late 1980s when infamously Andre Serrano and Robert Mapplethorpe are both attacked by Jesse Helms and a bunch of other kind of evangelical congressmen and organizations for purportedly obscene art, which was this, this was the culture wars, one of these kind of inflated situations that were aimed at attacking, marginalized artists and ultimately trying to take down the entire NEA. And there were all these fights around this. Obscenity pledges were made, in the early 1990s. Ultimately, when Gingrich's Congress comes to power in 1994 with the contract with America, they try to zero out the NEA entirely, and they're able to cut it by 40% and fundamentally force the organization to restructure and eliminate grants for individual artists, which is also hugely important. Back in the 1980s and 90s, to address the kind of second part of that question, when the NEA was awarding its composer fellowships, which were these grants for individual composers, basically commissions to a certain extent, and that was what had gotten the NEA kind of in trouble, was the idea that, even though that wasn't actually the case with Mapplethorpe and Serrano, the idea that, our tax dollars are going to fund Piss Christ was the kind of uproar situation. Obviously Jesse Helms did not care if our tax dollars were going to fund Charles Warren's latest, tone poem or whatever. But there was, one thing that I found interesting in the documentation, something that the musicologist Jan Pasler has also written about, is that those NEA grants were largely going to academic composers. I found a really remarkable letter from the composer Paul Drescher, who had served on NEA grants panels in the 1990s, where he basically says, he was a kind of post-minimalist composer. He saw, despite his presence on these panels, most of these composer fellowships going to the same kinds of composers who were writing tonal or atonal music in the academy, that they basically were uninterested in any music that had any kind of relationship to popular music, that had a relationship to minimalism, that had a relationship to performance art. And so even at a time when theoretically these kind of uptown, downtown categories are being shaken up, there were these still more conservative institutions that were being, because of the peer panel system, a lot of the panelists who were awarding the grants were themselves academic composers, rewarding them to other academic composers. So that was one of the drawbacks of the bureaucratization of the arts in this period, and some of the pitfalls around public funding. I ultimately, though, I think I make the case that public funding is necessary, and even if the bureaucracy can get in the way, the idea that our tax dollars can fund a composer to write a piece of music, I think is one of the more powerful and important and good things our tax dollars can do.
And that's a place where there's still a huge divide politically.
Yes,
and it's amazing, but there it is. So I read your doctoral dissertation, which was
I forgot about that.
tangentially related in a way to this, and I think some of the ideas that were in there ended up in this book, but I think there's enough in there that could be another book. But I think that's not where you're going for your next book. So why don't you tell us what you're up to?
Sure. The sentence "I read your doctoral dissertation" is one you hear about twice in your life, and if you're lucky, it comes from people who are on your doctoral committee. But thanks for reading, and I interviewed you for that as well. So the dissertation was on the kind of post-2000 indie classical scene, and I ultimately decided to spin it into a couple of journal articles because the scene was so ongoing, and I felt like I had kind of only captured some slice of it, and maybe I'll return to this kind of more questions around the present day. But even publishing that in 2016 or whatever versus 2021, the world of new music looks so different than it did 5 years ago, and the issues are so different too. So my next project is kind of moving chronologically backwards, but also kind of in the same era. It's a collaboration with my friend, an amazing musicologist named Carrie O'Brien, who's also a percussionist out in Seattle. And we are working on a book about minimalist music. So some of the more famous people from my book, like Steve Reich and Philip Glass, are going to be at the center of that, and also more kind of obscure people like Caroline Krister Hennix or Pandit Pran Nath or Paulina Oliveros, who's kind of not super obscure, but not necessarily considered part of the minimalist camp. And the book itself, it's a history of minimalism, but it's told through primary sources. So I think it's called Minimalist Music or Reader. It's with University of California Press. And so we're going to kind of be going from the late 1950s to the present following minimalism as it develops, but not, we'll have kind of little essays through our own voice, but we're going to be presenting, artistic manifestos, liner notes, important reviews and interviews by these composers to try to tell the story of minimalism from the voices who were there, whether those are composers, performers, critics, or otherwise, and to kind of revise the history of minimalism to, which is often kind of congealed around these four major composers, Lamont Young, Terry Riley, Philip Glass, Steve Reich, to move beyond that four and to look at a lot of different other composers, especially composers of color, women composers, but then also to kind of revise some of the history of those major four composers and tell stories about them that haven't been told before. So we're kind of in the middle stage of it. We're putting the book together. It's a fun kind of collaboration, gathering all the material, sifting through this stuff. Carrie knows the 50s and 60s and 70s really well. I know the later stuff well, but it's been fun learning about the earlier stuff. I'm teaching a minimalism class right now, which has been fun too. So yeah.
Great. I should say, for anyone out there who wants to read Will's doctoral dissertation, it is on his website, williamrobin.com.
Yeah, let me sell you on the book.
But also, yes, you definitely should get the book. The book is a great read, and it's important. But also beyond the doctoral dissertation on williamrobin.com, I think probably every article you've ever written, there's a link. So
there are a couple of things that aren't there because I don't want anyone to know about them. But yes,
okay.
I've got most of the stuff up there. Yeah.
If you've missed any of his Times pieces, there's links there. Musical Quarterly, everything. Well, Musical Quarterly, you have to basically subscribe to, because when you click onto that,
if you email me, I'll send you a PDF. Yeah.
Okay. I think that our time is probably coming to an end. So thank you so much for coming and doing this. This has been a very illuminating chat. And if you want more, everyone out there, again, the book, really good. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Allan. This was really lovely. And many thanks to the 92nd Street Y for putting this together. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so good night.
Good night.